All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Gustafson, Missouri Prairie Foundation Operations Coordinator, and I want to thank all of you for joining us at our webinar today. We are hosting our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Take a Virtual Hike on the Prairie Spring Edition with Bruce Schuette. Today's presentation is a pre-recorded video with Bruce Schuette, filmed a few weeks ago on MPF's Friendly Prairie. Bruce is here with us live for a Q&A after the video. During the video presentation, if you have any questions for Bruce, please put them in the Q&A section only on your screen, and at the end, I will read those out to Bruce. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. And now for some background on Bruce. Bruce Schuette retired from working for 36 years as a park naturalist at Cuivre River State Park, where he was involved in natural resource management, prescribed burns, invasive plant control, ecosystem management, natural resource inventory, collections, monitoring, working with researchers, and nature education. He has served on the MPF board since January 2000, served as secretary 2005 to 2012, and is vice president of science and management and chairman of the Science and Management Committee. We are excited to have Bruce here today to show us all around the prairie and share his prairie knowledge with us. And now let's take a virtual hike on Friendly Prairie in Pettis County.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Friendly Prairie. This is just a glorious spring morning. We had some rain pass through yesterday, but the storms have all cleared out, and we have just a beautiful morning on the prairie. This is on the eve of Earth Day, and what better way to celebrate Earth Day than to be out on one of our remnant native prairies. Just a little piece of what used to cover millions of acres of Missouri. This is Friendly Prairie. We're a little bit south of Sedalia, and Friendly Prairie is 40 acres. It was originally acquired by the Missouri Prairie Foundation in 1969. This was actually the very first prairie that the Prairie Foundation had acquired to protect and manage. And so it's been 55 years now that this little prairie, this little remnant of our native prairies, has been protected by the Prairie Foundation. So we're going to be taking a walk around and looking at a number of the things that have already showed up and are in flower here on the prairie. Friendly Prairie has, as I mentioned, been in MPF ownership for 55 years, and during that time there have been several plant surveys and that have been done here. Currently, the list we have for native species just on this 40-acre remnant prairie is right at 300. So it's very diverse what you can find out here in these 40 acres. We also have a few rare species, one rare plant, the Mead's milkweed, a federally listed species that has not been found here every year, but it has been found here several times in the past. We also have 4 rare animals, all insects that have been found here. There is a prairie mole cricket, Regal fritillary butterfly, a native bee, and the rattlesnake master stem borer moth. So we do have several rare species that are that are found here, with the great diversity of all life, but especially with the plant life and that we're going to be taking a look at. Now, with those 300 species, they range from species that you kind of find pretty much just everywhere on the landscape, including old fields and that, to the ones that are extremely restricted to remnant prairies. You've heard me mention before, but we have a thing called C values, or CC values, which stands for coefficient of conservatism. And this is a system that has been developed for Missouri by Doug Ladd, and most recently published by Doug Ladd and Justin Thomas. And this is a 0 to 10 listing of plants and how faithful they are to a natural community. So plants with a low score, like 0 to about 3, are pretty much found everywhere on the landscape, and they really don't tell you too much about the original conditions of that area. When you get species that are like in the 4, 5, and 6 range, that's really kind of the majority of what you find here on the prairie. They're not totally restricted maybe to prairies, but they are the main components of it, and this is primarily where you do find them, where they make up the bulk of the natural community. And then when you get the scores of 7, 8, 9, and 10, these are the ones that are pretty much restricted to just a remnant natural community, like a prairie or whatever natural community it is. So when you find those are the ones especially that tell you that this is an intact, usually a pretty healthy system, especially when you find quite a few of them. It tells you that it's a good intact system that has never been seriously disturbed in the past, or they simply wouldn't still be there. So this is a good indicator we have of the health of the prairie. And on Friendly Prairie, the average C value is over 4, which is considered very good when you have a natural community remnant with an average C value of 4 or more. It's usually a very good example of that natural community. And on this prairie, of those 300 species we have, about 10% or over 10%, 37 of them, are the remnant dependent, are the ecologically conservative species. So again, that speaks to the quality of the prairie, that many of the species found here are restricted just to remnants, like Friendly Prairie. And a couple of species we have right here now are this one, known as prairie phlox or downy phlox, a really pretty showy species early in the growing season. That's called downy phlox, or the scientific name for it is Phlox pilosa, and pilosa has to do with hairiness. And when you look very close at the stem, you will see that there is a fine hairiness covering the stem. That would also be where it gets the name downy phlox. And then right over here is one of our remnant dependent species. This is a cream wild indigo, or also called long-bracked wild indigo. This is one of the remnant dependent species with the C value of 7. And you can see it's a member of the pea family, these big, beautiful yellow flowers. This one comes out pretty early, and the flower cluster kind of arches over, kind of bends over and arches over. There is another kind of wild indigo out here, white indigo, but that blooms much later, like during the summer. That tends to be a bigger, kind of bushier looking plant with white flowers that stick straight up from the main part of the plant, as opposed to arching over like this cream wild indigo. I believe it's called wild indigo because for a while, or at times in the past, it has been used to make an indigo-like dye. Don't believe it was very good dye, but it was used to make die, and hence the name wild indigo. Here we have a spot on the prairie that the grass seems a little bit less dense through here, and one of the reasons might be because of these plants, especially the yellow one. This is a plant called wood betony, or also it's been known as lousewort, and this one is a plant that is partially parasitic. It still has some green leaves, and it does make its own food, but it also taps into other plants for food. And it's thought, or I've heard, that this plant, as it's growing here and tapping some resources out of the grasses or the other plants, might account for them being a little bit sparser here. So this is the wood betony or lousewort, a real pretty plant that has very unique flowers in kind of a circular pattern. And then just a little bit above it here is Indian paintbrush, one of the favorites of many people in spring prairies. The Indian paintbrush is also considered to be partially parasitic. I don't think it makes as much difference on what's growing around it, but it is considered to be a partially parasitic plant. The flowers kind of fool people, though, because what you think is like a big red flower is not actually just a flower. What you see, the little green tubular structures in here, are actually the flower itself. And the red that you see around it are called bracts. They're modified leaves that grow around the flower cluster. So Indian paintbrush actually has these smaller green flowers, but the whole inflorescence with these bracts gives it the real showiness. It's usually red, but you do sometimes get some yellow ones here in Missouri. There's only a couple kinds of Indian paintbrush, or a couple kinds of paintbrush in Missouri. This is the one common one. There's also a rare one that grows up on Luss Hill prairies. Common names for plants can sometimes be a little confusing, and right here are a couple examples. Of course, tallgrass prairies are known for grass, but a couple of the plants that have grass in the name aren't actually grasses. We've got a couple of them right here. This first one is a real pretty little yellow flower, and it's called yellow stargrass, but it's not a grass. As you can tell by the showy insect pollinated flowers. This one, I believe now, is considered to be in the lily family. It does have kind of long, thin, sort of grass-like leaves, but it's real pretty yellow flowers just kind of dotting the prairie right now. And then another plant that also gets confused is this one. It appears to just be beyond flower a little bit, or at least it's not open today, but this one is called prairie blue-eyed grass, and it's got kind of thick and flattened stems. The stems almost kind of remind you of those on an iris, domestically grown irises, and this is in the iris family. So typically when the flowers open, there will be, I believe it's 6 sort of petal-like parts. Typically, they're pale blue, although they can be pretty much just whitish also. But it's really noticeable when you see the plant up close, the flattened stem it has, which kind of reminds you that it's a member of the iris family. Here we have very commonly on the prairie right now one of the ragworts, prairie ragwort, and it's got a very showy yellow flower, really nice this time of year. And this, like many of the plants out here, is a member of the aster family, or the composites. And I guess the reason why they're called composites, and kind of interestingly, when you look at them, what looks like one flower is actually many flowers, a composite of many flowers. So like what I'm holding here in my finger is not one flower. You can see the center part of the flower, there's a whole bunch of tiny little tubular flowers in there. And these tubular flowers, called disc flowers, are complete total flowers themselves. So you can see there's many flowers in this one head. Many of these disc flowers, and then there's a special group of flowers that grows just around the outer edge called ray flowers, and they produce just each one has like one long petal or petal-like part. And so you get the ray flowers around the edge with the disc flowers in the middle, and so each one of these heads is a composite of many flowers. And that's the case for all the members of the composite or the aster family. It's one of the, or maybe the largest family of flowering plants on prairies, and that's a characteristic that puts them in that family. Like always on the prairie, you're not going to see everything in flower at once. And so here we have several things that are very characteristic of our tallgrass prairies and are all good signs of the prairie health, because they are all remnant dependent species. They'll be in their full glory later on, but we have the basal leaves from the pale purple coneflower. We also have New Jersey tea, a plant that was a very important food source of tea for people hundreds of years ago. And then we have white prairie clover. So these are all remnant dependent species, and they'll be adding a lot of color to the prairie a little bit later on this summer. We have a couple plants here that have some very interesting interactions with animals. One of them is our good remnant-dependent species here, rattlesnake master. It's still a while from blooming, but it's got these long, thin, kind of succulent-feeling leaves with little projections along the edge that make it look almost like a yucca, even though it's not a yucca at all and is actually in the carrot family. The rattlesnake master is the only host to a very rare moth called the rattlesnake master stem borer moth. And this moth seems to be pretty much rare everywhere, and for a long time it wasn't known to be in Missouri, and only in recent years has it been found in Missouri. And not only is it just found in Missouri, but it has been found actually on this prairie. So Friendly Prairie is host to this rare rattlesnake master stem borer moth. So an interesting relationship between this plant and that moth. The flowers, when they're in bloom, are attractive for many other insects to nectar and that, but it has this relationship with the stem borer moth, which only lays its eggs, and only the larvae only survive in the stem of this rattlesnake master and no place else. Now there's another plant here which instead of coming into bloom, it's one that is actually already past bloom. It's one of the earliest spring wildflowers out here on the prairie. It's a prairie trout lily. And the prairie trout lily a few weeks ago was in full bloom, was a very beautiful part of the prairie here. But now this flower was successful and it's now forming its pod or capsule where the seeds will form. And this is so the prairie trout lily as well as the rattlesnake master are both remnant dependent species, so they're good signs for the prairie, and then they also have interesting relationships with the plants. Now this trout lily, I believe this is one that the seeds have what are called aleosomes, which on the seeds there's actually this little sort of food packet that the plant attaches to the seed, which is used by ants for food. And so the ants will come and get the seeds with this aleosome. They take it back to their nest. They will feed on the aleosome part, but in the process of doing that, they are then dispersing and sort of planting the seed itself, which they just leave behind. They're only interested in the aleosome, but it's a way that the plant gets the ants to move their seeds around and to plant them. Several wildflowers we find out here on the prairie have kind of an interesting growth form of having only leaves at the very basal leaves, and no leaves on the stem at all. This one with the pale blue flowers is called wild hyacinth, and this is a member of the lily family. So very pretty kind of pale blue flowers, but distinctive in the long leafless stem and all the leaves being basal leaves. Two more characteristic plants of spring on the prairie would be a couple of the violet species that are found here. This one is called bird's foot violet. Beautiful flower, and the leaves are very highly dissected, so it has very much kind of a bird's foot look to it. So this is the bird's foot violet. You do sometimes get a second color variation of it where these lower petals are this color blue, but then the two petals that kind of point back are a really deep purple, really beautiful two-tone flower. But most of them you see on prairies are just a single color like you see here, and again that very highly dissected foliage. Another violet that you can find on most of our prairies this time of year is the arrow-leafed violet. And this is the arrow-leafed violet, and the leaves on it are much broader. They're not finely dissected. They do have a few teeth and that kind of at their base, which lend to the kind of arrow-leafed look that it has. And this is one of the violets that is very important to one of our rare species here on the prairie. This violet would be a food source for the caterpillar or the larva of the Regal fritillary. And Regal fritillaries are a rare butterfly we have here in Missouri. In fact, they've really disappeared across much of their range, and Missouri seems to be one of the relatively few kind of strongholds that it has, and they're being pretty intensely studied now to see how stable their populations are. But Regal fritillaries are known to pretty much only live on remnant tallgrass prairie and basically no place else, and the caterpillars feed on the violet leaves. So this plant is crucial for the for the Regal fritillary. They may feed on like the bird's foot violet and that too, and another prairie violet. But these prairie violets are the only host plants for the Regal fritillary, and so they're crucial for its survival. The Regal fritillary is an interesting species, and it's being studied pretty intensely right around here because there are good populations at several of the prairies in this vicinity. And so it has been documented that they are able to actually kind of move around from prairie to prairie. Not all of them, most of them stay in just one site, but a few individuals will go from this prairie to Drover's Prairie, or Drover's Prairie to this one, or over to Paintbrush Prairie, just a mile or a couple miles away. And so it is interesting that they will be able to move somewhat between the prairies. And this kind of movement and just their overall kind of movement is also very important, because the Regal fritillary overwinters kind of in the thatch, which when you do a prescribed burn is consumed by the fire. So they can be very sensitive to a prescribed burn, and yet they need the fire maintained habitat of the prairie for their survival and for their food plants and that. But we don't burn all of the prairie at one time. And in fact, just a little bit down below us here on the slope, you can see the prairie, the part of the prairie that hasn't been burnt this year. And so that's why if in any given year we only burn like a third to half the prairie, we never burn more than half, and that way we're maintaining part of the prairie for the Regal fritillary butterfly, among others, to maintain that stage in their life cycle, and then we'll rotate that so they can survive in the unburned areas one year, move back across, survive in this area next year when the other part of the prairie gets burnt. So by burning a portion of the prairie but not the whole thing, that helps ensure the continuance of the prairie, but at the same time meeting the needs for, in this case, the rare Regal fritillary butterfly. Another animal that's around that kind of likes that arrangement are a bird called the Henslow sparrow. And the Henslow sparrow is one of the true grassland birds that is an important part of the prairie ecosystem. But Henslow sparrows, while they like prairie, they kind of like having a little thatch to hide their nests in that in. So having, again, part of the prairie that's unburned in a given year is more attractive for the Henslow sparrows. So we rotate it around, and that ensures that there's always some areas, some parts of the prairie that are good habitat for them in a given year, and still while maintaining the prairie as a whole. Here in this part of the prairie, we've got a couple other plants that are very interesting. They're relatives of rattlesnake master. And if you're familiar with rattlesnake master, that has that kind of spherical ball of flowers on it, that is atypical for the parsley family that it is part of. These flowers here are much more typical for that family of plants. This is one of them called Golden Alexanders. And so in the parsley family, what's usually characteristic is that the flowers are in little groups, little clusters, and they're on stems or stalks that come out from the stem of the plant, almost like rays on an umbrella. So you can see all these stalks come out and then the flower cluster is at the end of them. Some of these, it does appear, are already actually in flower, so the flowers themselves are very tiny, but they're in these really nice showy clusters. And then this one is also a member of the same family as rattlesnake master, the parsley family. This one is known as prairie parsley. It's again, you can see that kind of umbel, like spokes on an umbrella, shape to the flower arrangement. This one has very dissected leaves, and this one, as well as that last species of golden Alexander we were looking at, are both remnant dependent species, so very good ones to see out here. Earlier in the hike, we talked about Indian paintbrush and the fact that it was those leafy bracts that give it its color were usually red, but occasionally you would find a yellow one. Well, lo and behold, farther along the hike, we find one of the Indian paintbrush with the yellow colored bracts. So really pretty. The ones around it are all the typical red, but this is the yellow form. And then I also mentioned that Indian paintbrush is a partially parasitic plant. Another plant that's partially parasitic is this little one right here called bastard toadflax. And so this also is a remnant dependent species, the bastard toadflax. It's in flower now, very small little flowers, but this is one that the Indians apparently would eat the seeds. I don't know how much they did it, because apparently the seeds are very tiny, but they supposedly had a pretty good flavor, and so the seeds from bastard toadflax could be a food source. The bright yellow flower right here is hoary puccoon, and the puccoon is an interesting plant. It is one that the roots actually used to be used to make a red dye. And then also the puccoon is a member of the borage family, and the inflorescence is known for having a shape almost like a scorpion's tail, like you can see right there, the way the flowers come off, and it just reminds you of a coiled scorpion's tail. So this is the hoary puccoon. There's a couple other kinds of puccoons. One less commonly found on prairies has flowers a more pale yellow, and it has a fringe on the petals. And then there's another one called plains puccoon, which has more yellowish flowers, and we have it down on a couple of our new sand prairies down in southeastern Missouri. Another prominent species on the prairie in the spring that, like the hyacinth, has basal leaves but then a leafless flowering stem is a shooting star. And shooting stars are just really spectacular little flowers. You can see the broader basal leaves, but then the same kind of leafless stalk, and then the flower cluster, and the flowers pointing down when they're in flower. But then, kind of interestingly, as it matures and as the moves into producing its seeds, the flowers will start to the old faded flowers will start to kind of turn up, and they'll be pointing up. And then that's where the seed capsule will form with the small little seeds inside it, which then you can find later on in the prairie. So this is a shooting star, really spectacular wildflower out here on the prairie in the spring. An abundant spring wildflower in both prairies and in wooded areas is the spring beauty. and it's frequently associated with being one of the first, earliest wildflowers to bloom. Not usually the first, but one of the first. Just pretty little white flowers, usually with some amount of pink streaking in them, and long, thin grass-like leaves. And then about the same time is another species that is very characteristic of the prairie, violet wood sorrel. It's got these very small leaves. Sometimes people even kind of think they're clover, but this is the violet wood sorrel. Typically blooms in the spring, but this is one that will occasionally bloom again in the fall if conditions are just right. This is scurfy pea. A little bit later in the spring, it'll get really tiny little purple flowers. They're nice little pea-shaped flowers, but not big like on the wild indigo. They're very tiny, but a very interesting plant and a good remnant dependent one. Also through here, and really throughout a big part of the prairie, has been prairie coreopsis or finger coreopsis, another remnant dependent species. Characteristically, it has these leaves which have a couple side lobes. So again, it almost gives you a turkey bird's foot kind of look to it. But this is prairie or finger coreopsis. As the spring progresses into summer, it'll get nice bright yellow flowers on it, and there has been lots of this all over the prairie. So it's just been amazing walking around this morning, and sometimes it seems like almost every step it's hard to avoid these remnant dependent species that are here. The abundance of them is just amazing, pointing to the quality of this prairie and the importance of protecting our remnant prairies like this. As we stand here in the middle of Friendly Prairie, surrounded by this wonderful display of spring wildflowers out here, I think it's really important for us to remember the true conservation significance of these remnant prairies like this. Out of what at one time was somewhere around 15 million acres of tallgrass prairie in Missouri, now we have less than 40 or 45,000 remnant acres, and unfortunately that's still disappearing. It's important for us to really take stock of how important it is to protect these last few remnants that we have. And I would argue that with the remnant prairies here, the significance is just amazing. What's at stake here? Just this one fairly small remnant of only 40 acres, as I mentioned, has about 300 different kinds of flowering plants. A study done here and Drover's Prairie some years ago found 120 species of native bees, of which a number of those were basically like remnant dependent bees. And now many ecologists look at a remnant prairie like this as really being an old growth natural community. It's not something that if sort of like beat up, it will come back. These prairies are irreplaceable, and a big part of that is because of the soils. These remnant prairie soils are extremely important, and soil scientists are just now starting to really be able to look at some more detail. We're still kind of at the early stages of being able to tell what's out here, but they are able to tell that the microbial communities in prairies are extremely diverse, and it's been said that they're more diverse than any other ecosystem on Earth. And our tallgrass prairies are among the most threatened. Worldwide, temperate grasslands are the least protected and the rarest of major natural ecosystems, and our tallgrass prairies here in the U.S. are probably about the rarest or among the rarest of the temperate grasslands. So we really have the rarest of the rare here. And in fact, for many years, people actually looked at smaller remnants like Friendly Prairie here, or some of our other prairies like Snowball Hill and Noah Brown, and they wouldn't even have particularly considered acquiring it because they didn't think they were big enough to support this biodiversity long range. But now, actually, some studies have shown that globally, the only good way to protect our total range of biodiversity is by protecting smaller sites. That these small sites are extremely important in protecting the total range of biodiversity on Earth. And as you look out across what we have here, I think you probably would be kind of amazed. This has been a fairly small, fairly isolated prairie for many years, certainly for over 55 years that the Prairie Foundation has owned it, and yet it's an excellent natural community, or it's a natural community in excellent shape, as kind of shown by some community health indexes that we have done in recent years. It still supports these remnant dependent species. It is not very invaded by exotic species, and so pretty much every measure, after many years of being a fairly isolated small remnant, it's still doing just great. And so I would argue that in conservation, what's most important in many cases, like with our remnant tallgrass prairies, is quality over quantity. And certainly it doesn't take a very large site that's high in quality, if it's managed properly, to maintain its biological significance.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for leading the virtual hike on the prairie that we were able to share with folks today. We do have some questions that I will do my best to get through. And we might go a little bit over 5 if that's okay with you, to get some of these answered. But we're going to kick right off with a question about 2 of the plants that you highlighted during the hike, which were the wild hyacinth and the shooting star. And so this question asks, why do some flowers have no leaves on the stem? Is there an advantage for the plant with this? And does it help it to reach sunlight when other plants are competing for light?
That's a good question. And well, first of all, thank you, Emily, for doing all the video work and the editing and that to put this video together. It was a great morning to be out on Friendly Prairie that morning. It was right after a rainstorm and the prairie was just looking fantastic. And so thank you for your work in putting all of this together. As far as the leaf arrangement on plants, I don't know that I've ever heard a particular reason for it. Plants have different types of leaf arrangements. Some of them, the leaves are opposite on the stem. Some of them are alternate. There are a number of plants that do have leaves just at the base, some primarily at the base, some only at the base. I've never really heard of a particular reason or an adaptation that might be far. It's probably not necessarily helping them get sun because the leaves are actually still down very low on the plant. But if it's some kind of an actual adaptation, I've never heard of any particular reason.
Thank you, Bruce. Another question about the plant species highlighted. So when you say a plant is remnant dependent, what does that mean? So for example, rattlesnake master is a plant that may grow in places other than a prairie, like in someone's garden. Like I have rattlesnake master in my front yard. But when we say a species is remnant dependent, sort of what does that mean? And what does that tell us sort of about the broader sort of ecological community on the prairie?
Basically, that means that it is restricted to a remnant natural community, but there can be overlaps on species as to what natural communities are part of. So we know that, prairies are grasslands, but there are several other natural communities in Missouri that are considered basically grasslands too, like glades, which basically are very dry, rocky prairies. Savannas, which are basically a prairie ground cover, but with some scattered trees, or even open woodlands. The key for those is basically where you have a fairly open canopy, so you're still getting quite a bit of sunlight to the ground level. In a true forest, ground level plants receive very little sunlight. But when you have the open woods, savanna, prairies, and glades, you're getting quite a bit of sunlight down to the ground level. And that's what a number of these plants seem to need. So like rattlesnake master and lead plant and many of the species we find on prairies can also be found in glades, savannas, open woodlands. So these are plants that still are on the wild are basically dependent on a remnant natural community. That community could be a prairie, it could be a glade. It's one of, in this case, like these open grassland communities, but the plants are still basically dependent on that remnant community. Now, some of the remnant dependent plants will grow in more of a planting situation if you directly plant them there. I don't know if they will persist as long, but certainly they will grow in, in a setting where they are planted and the conditions are enough similar. But you just don't find them like, say, spreading out along roadsides or popping up in old fields or other places that have been severely disturbed or where there's been a lot of soil disturbance. It's been plowed, something like that. So basically, remnant dependent doesn't mean it's only in the prairie. For a few species, that's the case, but many of the species that are remnant dependent need a remnant natural habitat, but it could be one of several different kinds of natural communities that the plants can be part of that system.
Thank you. And in answering that question, you also answered another question that was asked that was about shooting star, golden alexander, spring beauties, cream wild indigo. This question asker said that she has those in her woodland in Crawford County. And so she asked, does that indicate it was a prairie, or do these plants grow in different natural communities? And I think you answered with that question that there are species that don't just occur right on our remnant prairies. They do occur in other natural communities in Missouri. And that mix of plants may be quite different in a woodland than on a remnant prairie, but you might see, spring beauty in the woods as well as on your prairie.
Right. especially if it's many kind of wooded hillsides, especially on like south or west slopes that get more sun exposure. And they'll oftentimes be much more open woodlands in those situations, and they will be the ones that frequently have those kinds of plants in them. So yeah, they can be part of a woodland, an open woodland natural community also.
Great. This is a related question that I think I can answer, but I'll let you, Bruce, if you want to say, anything in addition to it. So this is a question: are the violets that grow in my lawn also a host plant for fritillaries? And so, yes, those violets are a host plant for certain species of fritillary butterflies. The Regal fritillary butterfly is not going to be probably hosting on the violets in your lawn, but a great spangled fritillary, which is very common in sort of our suburban and urban environments, you might find hosting on your the violets in your yard. So they are still great host plants, just for different species of fritillaries.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and the Regal, I think they're still trying to find out exactly what the larva can survive on, but they don't go into the woods. So they're going to depend on the violets that are growing in the open prairies. Yep.
Great. So we had another question about Regal fritillaries. And so when it comes to sort of tracking and surveying the Regal fritillaries, is there a yearly survey that is done to track how they are doing? What are the components of kind of studying Regal fritillaries on our remnant prairies?
Yeah, in recent years, there have been more concerted efforts to really try and track their numbers over the years. In the past, I know there were sort of observations that were made and maybe an occasional survey was done, but nothing that was repeated yearly or really trying to track their numbers quite as much. But now, because of their rarity, that's really being looked at. So in recent years, there have been some surveys done, so repeated either yearly or at least every couple of years on a number of prairies by staff from like the Missouri Department of Conservation, and in some cases we've helped out on some of our prairies, but also right in the area around Sedalia, there's been some more intensive surveys done through a professor at Central Missouri State University. And he has looked at Friendly Prairie, Drover's Prairie, Lordy Marker's Prairie, as well as Paintbrush Prairie, that's a conservation department prairie, and really looked in much more detail at the numbers, even I believe marking them and that to try and get population estimates and that. So in recent years, there have been regular surveys done on a number of MPF prairies.
Great. And in the follow-up email that you all receive, there will be a link to a webinar that some of those researchers actually did for us a couple of years ago about tracking and studying Regal fritillaries on our remnant prairies. So if you're interested in learning more about this, take a look at that link that you will have in the follow-up email. So here's another kind of plant community question about Friendly. What grass species are common at Friendly Prairie?
Well, it would be a pretty long list. But I think it's got pretty much all the major prairie grasses you normally think about, big and little blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass. I know Friendly Prairie, I believe, also has like Eastern gamma grass. It's got prairie dropseed. It's one of our prairies that I believe has a population of porcupine grass, which is a very interesting looking, pretty unique kind of grass. So the list would be pretty long to go through, to try and go through all of them, but it would have most of the main prairie grasses, as well as a few of the more notable ones like that. I know just not too many years ago we found some Canada wild rye there that wasn't on any of the older lists from the prairie. So there's a considerable number of them.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So another question that folks had was, we recorded this back in April, and this is also a year where I think a lot of flowers, like a lot of the forbs, are blooming a little bit earlier than maybe they typically do. But if were to go out to Friendly Prairie now or in the next like week or two, what are some of the species that we might see blooming in May on Friendly Prairie?
Oh, well, it's kind of hard to say for sure, but kind of going into the next group. Well, some of them that we mentioned that were not quite in flower yet, but those will be in the next group. And I'm not sure just how it will be this year, but I would tend to think at least kind of like middle of May into early June, probably have like the finger coreopsis, things like New Jersey tea, probably lead plant, pale purple cone flowers, at least into the end of May. You'd start having a number of things like that. Things like the rattlesnake master and blazing stars would usually come a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the things that we saw that were not quite in flower at this point in time, those will be, the ones that will be kind of in that next group, kind of late spring and going into the first part of summer. I know, any time is good to visit, as there is just a change going on. But a lot of times right around the end of May and early June is really considered a very peak time to be out on a prairie seeing a lot of these things. It can get to be pretty spectacular. I know around the first part of June, we do the Prairie Bio Blitz. This year, it's going to be on June 1st down at Sheldon Cook Memorial Meadow down in the southwestern corner of the state. But we did that because usually about the first part of June is really considered a highlight time for getting out and seeing a prairie in flower.
Thank you, Bruce. That was a wonderful segue into mentioning the BioBlitz as you did. I put a link in the chat for anyone who is interested in attending the BioBlitz. We do ask that you register ahead of time. We do have many small groups that will be doing various activities on Cook Meadow. That's June 1st and 2nd. So please do sign up, register for the groups that you are interested in. It is a great and wonderful event. Bruce will be there in person, and it is a beautiful time to, every time is a beautiful time to visit our prairies, as Bruce said. But early, that first weekend of June, when we have the BioBlitz, it should be really, really wonderful. So please follow that link that is in the chat if you are interested, and find out more and register for the BioBlitz this year, which we do hold every year at one of our prairies. Okay, back to questions. This one is about sort of using like our more conservative species in prairie reconstructions or restorations. So if a plant is highly conservative, so if it's, we're looking at that like 7, 8, 9, 10 like CC value, does that mean that they're unlikely to thrive in prairie reconstructions? And what does it take to get more conservative species being more successful in reconstructions or restoration projects?
Yeah, and that's reconstruction or plantings isn't my specialty, but I basically it just kind of varies among species. There are a number of them that would be very difficult to get started in a planting. For some reason, there's just not, in plantings, there's just not something in the soil that they need, whether or not it's, trace elements or microbes or something. And so many of the remnant dependent species are very difficult to get started in a planting. There are some, though, that you can. Rattlesnake master mentioned, pale purple cone flowers. There are a number of them that you can get started. Again, there's still so much unknown, especially about what's in the soil and what the plants need. That so some remnant dependent species, even though they don't just kind of spread into really disturbed areas, but if planted into certain situations, they seem to do just fine, but other ones for whatever reason just don't. So that is always one of the things that is kind of difficult in plantings and reconstructions, is to get the conservative species into them. Some it works out, but others it's very difficult or virtually impossible. In some cases, people were trying to get some of them started like in more of a greenhouse setting to get them started and then transplant rather than put the seeds in. Again, I'm not sure how well that technique works. But yeah, it's a challenge. So some work out, but some you probably pretty much just have to go to a remnant to find them, which is one of the things that makes them very unique, and one of the kind of challenges, and one of the great things about being out and finding these species out on a remnant prairie that you won't find anywhere else.
Yeah, and this is actually related to another question that was asked, which is, we have seeded plantings, like seeded restorations. There are all kinds of different factors that you have to think about. The site conditions, soil, level of disturbance, whether it's a reconstruction or a restoration, sort of what was there previously. And also when you're looking at this array of species, there are relationships that, as Bruce said, that we don't always have, we don't always have a full handle on yet. But also there are some species that are just, it's easier to germinate their seed. They will thrive in more kind of generalist like settings, including your yard. And so this is a question kind of about the relationship of native plants we might have in our yard to plants that we see on prairie. So how similar are plants on remnant prairies to those purchased and planted in our gardens, like from native plant retailers in Missouri? Sizes seem much larger in gardens. Is this due to less competition, differences in soil type, or just ecotype differences?
It's hard to say for sure, but certainly less competition could be a big part of it. Within prairies, as we mentioned, prairies are really an old growth type of natural community where there's an immense amount of root material in the soil. That's where the majority of the plants is actually underground. We just see the little bit that's sticking up, but most of the plant is underground. So the roots are just packed in there. and it's really kind of a fight for the nutrients and that they need, and so you tend to get this very stable system. And so if you have, if you do get the plant started and they're more or less in the open, kind of by themselves, if there's nothing limiting them in the soil, then they are going to have kind of a free ride. They don't have this competition from all these other plants growing there and that have all the nutrients kind of locked up and that. And so it would make sense that those plants then oftentimes could get bigger in that. I'm not really sure beyond that. I do know that when you get plants from, I guess, especially the good reputable seed companies like we have here in Missouri, a number of them, that the plants they get, from what I've been told, were originally sourced wild plants. They still harvest seed from remnant prairies. I've just recently heard that, like, when they do plantings to get to have a population of plants they can harvest for seed, but after just a few years, those kind of peter out. So they do need to sort of continuously be refreshing those stocks with sort of wild grown seed. So, it is going to be from the good seed companies, it's going to be plants that were, at least within a few generations, were probably growing in a prairie remnant. So yeah, it would be the same plants.
Yeah, and I would just add to that if you are growing native prairie plants in your garden, or if you have a garden project in your community, and you, like I said, you're planting native prairie plants, those came from a prairie plant seed source, and MPF prairies are used as seed sources for some native seed collectors. And we also use seed on our prairies for restoration purposes and that sort of thing. But, when it comes to the kind of connection between those prairie plants that you have in your garden and why we need to protect our remnant prairies, including diversity on our remnant prairies, as Bruce mentioned, it's not just an individual plant species, but genetic diversity within that plant species too. And so the work that we do conserving these remnant prairies also provides the seed for using native plants in native plantings in suburban and urban areas. And so, that's also really important to ask about seed sources and plant sources when you are purchasing native plants. And we have our Grow Native resource guide, which I will link in the email that you receive after the presentation, which will have that listing of native plant suppliers of native plant products and services, including seeds and plants. And some of those Grow Native members do harvest seed from our MPF prairies. All right. Here's another question sort of about the total conservation that we do at MPF. And this might be a little challenging to answer, Bruce, but I'm gonna kick it to you anyway. How many separate remnant prairies of the size of Friendly, so 40 acres, I guess, or larger, are there in Missouri, and how many are being held by MPF?
MPF has 35 sites. I believe all but one or two of them have at least partially remnant prairies. In some cases, when we get an area, it's the whole thing isn't prairie. It may be, a portion of it, a half or a quarter or something, or 3/4 that's a remnant prairie, and we have to get the whole property and that, and we can plant around the edge to kind of even buffer it maybe a little bit. But so basically we have over 30 prairies, A few of them are less than 40 acres in size. A good number of them are over 40 acres. Golden Prairie, the original remnant, is 320 acres. And then a couple others are sort of complexes we have, like Denison Latner and Pleasant Run Creek. So we have, that's what we have. Currently, of the acreage of prairie that's left in Missouri, it's generally considered probably around 40,000 acres. And I think around half of that, or maybe just over half, are prairies that are in conservation ownership. And that would include like the Prairie Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, the Missouri Department of Conservation, the Department of Natural Resources, University of Missouri. Probably there's a couple others too. So there are a number of prairies in conservation ownership of some sort. But there are still a number of privately held prairies still in Missouri, of which we're working to try and bring more under conservation ownership, including MPF ownership. As far as the exact number of prairies, especially about that size, I'm not sure just what it is. But there aren't too many privately owned prairies left that are very large. And that means even in the several hundred acre category. So most of the remnants that are left are probably under about 160 acres with very few over that. So most of the remnant prairies that are left, there's still a number scattered around, but most of them are on the size of 40 acres. A lot of them are less and some are a little bit more, but there's not too much as far as any really big prairies that are still left in private ownership. They're just basically all gone.
Thank you, Bruce. And you can learn more about the properties that MPF owns, stewards, and manages on moprairie.org and under where we work. I put the link in the chat a little bit ago. And that is great to see, information about our different prairie properties and also a map of the properties that we have. But yes, there are others to visit as well. And ours, though, are open to the public to access on foot. And we do encourage you to visit our prairies. So I have one more, I think we've got time for one more question.
Sure.
And this is about the coefficient of conservatism. Do you have, Bruce, a good reference for people who want to look up the CC value of different plant species in Missouri?
Yeah, the published reference is, I think it's called an ecological checklist of the flora, or something like the ecological checklist of the plants of Missouri, or something like that. In fact, I could go get it real quick and check. It was published in just an organization published it some years ago, and that's really kind of the official publication. Or if you want, I can get you that and could put it in the chat for tomorrow. I think it's probably on the website actually, but so you could, or put that in the email tomorrow. But yeah, that's really the current like published source of it, is that checklist by Doug Ladd and Justin Thomas.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. We will, it looks like Erica did drop that in the chat for folks who are still with us. And I will include it in tomorrow's email. So thank you, Bruce, so much for leading us through this virtual hike on Friendly Prairie. Really appreciate getting to see the prairie in early spring and be able to share that with everyone on this webinar. As I mentioned, the webinar has been recorded and an email will be sent to all of you tomorrow with the webinar link and other resources, including those that we've mentioned. As a reminder, if you would like to visit Friendly Prairie yourself, it is just a few miles south of Sedalia, or any of MPF's prairies. They are open to the public to enjoy on foot for hiking, photography, and bird watching. We didn't talk about birds on Friendly this time, but we did see or hear, we saw and heard a couple that were kind of meadowlark and the scissortail flycatcher. I think you saw too, Bruce, when you were out there.
And the Henslow sparrows were already back then, and probably now there's lots of dick thistles there.
Yeah, so it's part of the Coal Camp important bird area. So that includes some of our other prairies as well. So if you're a birder, we do encourage you to go out and visit our prairies in that Pettis Benton County area if you want to see some birds. But all of our prairies are open to hiking, photography, and bird watching. And you can learn more about those prairies on our website. I will reiterate that we are hosting our 13th annual Bio Blitz at Shelton L. Cook Memorial Meadow near Golden City on June 1st and 2nd. And so please refer to the link in the chat for more information about the Bio Blitz. It's also in the events on our website, moprairie.org. If you enjoyed this presentation, we hope you'll join us for our May 22nd MPF webinar, where we'll learn all about recording invasive plant species on EdMaps. We will also be hosting a webinar on documenting pollinators through photography with Angela Morehouse, author of the new book, Flower Bugs, on June 5th. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Bruce, and have a wonderful Wednesday evening. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.